On the surface, the house at 92 2nd Street in Fall River, Massachusetts looks harmless, even quaint. A 2.5-story clapboard structure with plain white siding and a simple sloping roofline, it resembles countless New England homes from the late 19th century. Its square shape and unremarkable design do little to prepare visitors for the story it hides. Yet behind those walls, on an ordinary August morning in 1892, a crime unfolded so brutal that it not only horrified the nation but permanently branded the name Lizzie Borden into American folklore. To understand the chilling aura of this house, one must first understand the family who lived there. The Borden household was far from happy. At its head was Andrew Jackson Borden, a wealthy man by the standards of Fall River, though he lived with an almost obsessive frugality. Despite his fortune, Andrew refused to move his family into the fashionable Hill district, where other elites enjoyed sprawling estates. Instead, he kept them confined to the modest house on 2nd Street, a dwelling situated in a less desirable part of town. His thrift was notorious, gaslighting was limited, meals were simple to the point of austerity, and conveniences that other families of similar wealth enjoyed were absent. Living under Andrew's roof were his second wife, Abby Borden, his adult daughters Emma and Lizzie, and the family's maid, Bridget Sullivan. The household was tense, strained by resentment and suspicion. Emma, at 41, was the quieter of the sisters, but Lizzie, at 32, was outspoken and headstrong. Both daughters harbored resentment toward their stepmother Abby, whom they accused of marrying Andrew for his money. They referred to her not as mother, but coldly as Mrs. Borden, a distance that reflected the emotional gulf within the home. Lizzie, in particular, was said to chafe against her father's restrictions. Intelligent, independent, and accustomed to society's expectations of refinement, she bristled at Andrew's refusal to indulge in the trappings of wealth. While other young women of her class traveled, entertained, and adorned themselves in fine clothing, Lizzie found herself constrained by her father's iron thrift. To neighbors, the Bordens may have appeared a respectable family of means. Inside the house, resentment simmered like a pot ready to boil over. By the summer of 1892, the household had grown particularly strained. Rumors swirled that Andrew had begun dividing his property in ways that favored Abby's relatives, threatening to diminish the inheritance of his daughters. Emma withdrew frequently to visit friends, leaving Lizzie alone with a father she respected but resented, and a stepmother she openly disliked. The atmosphere in the house grew heavy, charged with suspicion and unspoken hostility. The events of August 4th shattered what fragile order remained. That morning began like countless others. Breakfast served in the kitchen, routine chores carried out in silence. Yet by mid-morning, 2 bodies would lie in pools of blood within the house's walls. Abby Borden was found upstairs in the guest bedroom, her skull split open by repeated blows from a hatchet or axe. Her body, twisted unnaturally on the floor, bore the violence of a rage that stunned investigators. Hours later, Andrew Borden was discovered on the parlor sofa, his face hacked so brutally that one eye was nearly severed. The crime was not only shocking in its ferocity, but chilling in its intimacy. Whoever committed it had struck within the confines of the family home, in broad daylight, without a single neighbor hearing or seeing the murders unfold. The crime scene itself was ghastly, a nightmare etched into the wooden walls. Policemen, unaccustomed to such violence, stumbled through the rooms in disbelief. Neighbors gathered outside, craning their necks for glimpses of the horror within. Word spread quickly through Fall River and beyond. Andrew and Abby Borden had been butchered in their own home. Suspicion, almost immediately, turned inward. The locked nature of the house, the absence of forced entry, and the narrow window of time suggested the killer was someone inside. Lizzie, with her calm but inconsistent answers to police questions, became the focus of attention. While Bridget Sullivan wept and trembled, Lizzie's composure struck many as unsettling. When asked where she had been during her father's murder, her story shifted. Sometimes she claimed to have been in the barn, other times in the kitchen. When pressed about her stepmother's whereabouts earlier in the day, she seemed uncertain. And then there was the matter of motive. Lizzie stood to gain greatly from her father's fortune if both he and Abby were dead. Coupled with her strained relationship with Abby, and resentment toward Andrew's financial choices. The picture began to darken. Within days, whispers grew louder. Could Lizzie have wielded the axe? The newspapers seized upon the story with ghoulish fervor. The Fall River tragedy dominated headlines across the country, and Lizzie's name became synonymous with the crime. Her face, sketched in courtroom drawings, was printed alongside lurid accounts of blood, greed, and betrayal. The press fed the public's hunger for scandal, painting Lizzie as both a cold-blooded killer and a tragic victim of circumstance. And from this frenzy emerged the rhyme that would echo across generations. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41, though exaggerated. Abby suffered around 18 blows, Andrew 11. The rhyme immortalized Lizzie as the axe murderer of Fall River, whether or not she was guilty. The words became folklore, stitched into America's cultural memory, ensuring that the murders at 92 2nd Street would never be forgotten. Yet the mystery was far from resolved. Lizzie was arrested, tried, and ultimately acquitted, leaving the murders officially unsolved. But acquittal did not erase suspicion. Neighbors whispered, friends withdrew, and the house itself began to acquire a reputation not only for violence but for haunting. Visitors in later decades would claim to hear footsteps pacing upstairs, muffled sobs echoing through empty rooms, and doors opening and closing without explanation. The murders had stained the house in more ways than blood. They had imprinted it with legend. And so the story of the Borden house begins not with the trial, nor even with the murders themselves, but with the house on 2nd Street, a place where tension brewed, resentment hardened, and shadows lingered long after August 4th, 1892. It is a story of family, betrayal, and the uncanny persistence of memory. And as with Salem before it, one must ask, does the haunting come from restless spirits or from the weight of history itself, replaying in endless echo? August 4th, 1892, dawned hot and heavy in Fall River, Massachusetts. The kind of summer day where the air clung close to the skin, thick and oppressive. Inside the Borden home at 92 2nd Street, the morning began quietly, though beneath the surface unease lingered. The family's maid, Bridget Sullivan, rose early to prepare breakfast despite feeling ill from the stifling heat. She had wanted a day off, but Lizzie insisted she stay. The family gathered around the table. Andrew and Abby Borden, Bridget and Lizzie. Emma, the elder sister, was away visiting friends. Breakfast was ordinary. Bread, mutton, coffee, and cold leftovers. Yet later, witnesses would recall that members of the household had complained of stomach upset in the days before the murders. Some speculated food poisoning, others whispered of deliberate poisoning. The possibility that someone within the house had tampered with the food became one of many sinister details investigators would later pick apart. After breakfast, the household divided into its routines. Andrew prepared to leave for his business errands. Abby busied herself with chores upstairs. Bridget went about cleaning, though the oppressive heat made every task heavier than it should have been. Lizzie seemed restless, moving from room to room, offering vague comments that later raised suspicion. One moment she said she was ironing, another that she was looking for fishing sinkers in the barn. Her shifting story became a critical piece of the puzzle. At some point between 9:00 and 9:30 a.m., Abby Borden was attacked. She had gone upstairs to make the bed in the guest room, a simple task that would end in her violent death. She was struck from behind by a hatchet or axe. The first blow cut deep, dropping her to the floor. The killer did not stop. Blow after blow rained down, crushing her skull, splattering blood across the walls and carpet. When she was finally still, her body twisted grotesquely beside the bed, her face nearly unrecognizable, her hair matted with blood. It was later counted that she suffered around 18 blows in total, overkill that spoke to rage rather than necessity. Downstairs, life continued as if nothing had happened. Bridget, ordered by Lizzie to wash windows, labored in the heat. Neighbors later testified that she looked pale and weak, wiping sweat from her brow as she moved between the yard and the kitchen. Lizzie drifted about the house, her movements curiously unaccounted for during critical moments. When Andrew returned home around 10:45 a.m., Bridget let him in, and he settled into the sitting room to rest on the sofa. He removed his boots and lay back, unaware of what had already happened upstairs. It was then that the second murder occurred. As Andrew rested, the killer approached him in the sitting room. A hatchet came down with merciless precision, striking his face and head repeatedly. One blow split his skull so deeply that one of his eyes was nearly cut in two, dangling grotesquely from the socket. He was struck at least 11 times, each blow leaving his features more mangled, until he was barely recognizable. The attack was savage, personal, and committed in daylight, a crime of shocking intimacy. Bridget later recounted that she had gone upstairs to her room to rest after completing her chores, leaving Lizzie alone in the lower part of the house. Moments later, Lizzie called out, her voice ringing with urgency. "Maggie, come quick! Father's dead. Somebody's come in and killed him." Bridget rushed down the stairs to find Andrew slumped on the sofa, blood pooling beneath him, his wounds fresh and horrific. Lizzie stood nearby, calm yet insistent, directing Bridget to fetch help. Neighbors were called, and soon the house was a frenzy of activity. Policemen arrived, stumbling over themselves as they took in the horror of the scene. News traveled fast in Fall River, and within hours a crowd gathered outside, whispering in shock at the spectacle unfolding inside the Borden home. The police were baffled. 2 brutal murders had been committed within the confines of the house in broad daylight, without a single witness to the killings. No signs of forced entry were found. Nothing had been stolen. Whoever had committed the crime had moved freely within the home, striking with ferocity and leaving just as quietly. The conclusion seemed unavoidable. The murderer was someone inside. Suspicion turned toward Lizzie almost immediately. Bridget had been outside or upstairs for much of the morning, her presence accounted for. Andrew had returned home unexpectedly early, narrowing the window of opportunity. Emma was away. Lizzie, calm and curiously unshaken, offered shifting accounts of her whereabouts, claiming at one moment to have been in the barn searching for fishing sinkers, and at another in the kitchen. Yet investigators who checked the barn found no footprints in the dust, no signs of recent activity. Her demeanor also raised eyebrows. Rather than collapse into grief, Lizzie seemed collected, even businesslike as neighbors swarmed the house. She spoke matter-of-factly about fetching help, and her clothes showed no visible blood. Yet police later learned that she had burned one of her dresses, claiming it had been ruined by paint. To investigators, this act seemed more like an attempt to conceal evidence than a household chore. The bodies of Andrew and Abby were carried out, and the Borden home transformed into a crime scene. The photographs taken that day, stark and disturbing, still exist. Abby's body twisted beside the guest room bed, Andrew's face mutilated beyond recognition on the sofa. These images, frozen in black and white, remain among the earliest and most infamous crime scene photographs in American history. Neighbors whispered. Reporters scribbled feverishly, and Fall River reeled from the shock. Who could wield such savagery? Was it an intruder who had slipped away unnoticed, or was the murderer someone within the family? All eyes turned to Lizzie, the unmarried daughter whose motives, demeanor, and opportunity made her the prime suspect. The morning of August 4th had begun like any other in Fall River, a house of silence, chores, and routine. By noon, it had become a house of horror, its walls soaked with suspicion as much as with blood. And from that day forward, the Lizzie Borden house would never again be just a family home. It became a symbol of violence, mystery, and haunting, its story whispered in rhyme, remembered in fear, and immortalized in legend. The murders of Andrew and Abby Borden spread through Fall River like fire in dry grass. By the afternoon of August 4th, 1892, the once quiet 2nd Street was choked with townsfolk. Neighbors pressed shoulder to shoulder, craning their necks for a glimpse of the infamous Borden house. Word had traveled with alarming speed. Andrew and Abby had been killed, butchered in their own home. Fall River was no stranger to crime, but this was different. The brutality of the attacks, the intimacy of the killings, and the social standing of the victims combined to create a storm of horror and fascination. Andrew Borden was not only wealthy, but also known for his stern respectability. For him to be cut down on his own sofa, his skull hacked open in broad daylight, was unthinkable. And Abby, killed upstairs as she carried out household duties, seemed an even greater violation of domestic sanctity. The city buzzed with questions, gossip, and rumors, each more sensational than the last. Neighbors gave testimony freely, often contradicting one another. Some claimed they had seen a strange man lurking near the property. Others whispered of tensions within the family that had been simmering for years. Few believed an intruder could have slipped in and out unnoticed. The murders had taken place in broad daylight, in a house where people were coming and going. The absence of forced entry, the lack of theft, and the timing of the killings pointed to someone on the inside. Suspicion settled quickly on Lizzie. Her composure unnerved many. While Bridget Sullivan wept, retching at the sight of the bodies, Lizzie stood calm, even detached, directing others to fetch doctors and police. Her clothing showed no obvious bloodstains, yet she offered little clarity about her movements during the crucial hours. Worse, her accounts changed. At one moment, she insisted she had been in the barn. Later, she said she had been in the kitchen. Investigators noted these inconsistencies, and the newspapers pounced. The dress incident fueled gossip. Days after the murders, Bridget and a friend of Lizzie's, Alice Russell, witnessed Lizzie burning a dress in the stove, claiming it had been stained with paint. To investigators, this act screamed of cover-up, a possible attempt to destroy blood evidence. To the public, it confirmed suspicion. Only a guilty woman would burn her clothes so soon after such a crime. Fall River was transfixed. Newspapers printed lurid headlines. The Borden mystery. The Hatchet horror. Did Lizzie do it? Reporters swarmed the town, sketching the Borden house, describing the gruesome wounds in detail, and speculating wildly about Lizzie's motives. Her gender became a central fascination. Could a woman, especially a respectable church-going one, commit such atrocities? Many insisted it was unthinkable. Women, they argued, were not capable of such violence. Others, however, whispered that Lizzie's cold demeanor and sharp independence made her different. Perhaps dangerously so. The trial by newspaper began long before the courtroom proceedings. Illustrations of Lizzie, her calm face framed by stern clothing, appeared nationwide. The rhyme that would immortalize her name began to circulate almost immediately, cementing the image of her as an axe-wielding murderer. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. It mattered little that the rhyme exaggerated the numbers. Abby had been struck around 18 times, Andrew 11. The cadence of the verse, catchy and chilling, ensured it would survive far longer than any newspaper article. Inside Fall River, the reaction was divided. Some neighbors defended Lizzie, insisting she could never have done such a thing. She was active in church, involved in charity, and known for her refined manners. Others whispered of her temper, her strained relationship with Abby, and her growing resentment of her father's tight grip on the family's wealth. Lizzie's inheritance loomed large in the public imagination. With Andrew and Abby dead, she and Emma stood to gain a fortune. Motive, opportunity, and suspicion aligned like pieces of a grim puzzle. The police investigation, however, was a clumsy affair. Officers bungled evidence, allowed neighbors to trample through the crime scene, and failed to secure the home properly. By the time they searched the barn and inspected Lizzie's clothing, much had already been disturbed. The murder weapon itself was never conclusively identified, though several hatchets were found on the property. One, its handle broken, became the favored suspect, but proof remained elusive. Despite the uncertainty, the public wanted answers, and the authorities needed a suspect. Within days, Lizzie was formally arrested. Her composure at the funeral had already raised eyebrows. She stood stiff, almost aloof, while others wept. Some interpreted her calm as guilt, others as shock. But in the court of public opinion, her behavior became damning evidence. As the investigation unfolded, Fall River transformed into a stage. Reporters crowded the streets. Artists sketched the faces of spectators, and gossip ran faster than fact. The trial would become one of the most sensational in American history. But even before it began, Lizzie was both condemned and defended in equal measure. For Fall River, the murders were more than tragedy. They were spectacle. The city's genteel reputation was shattered. Neighbors who had once nodded politely on the street now whispered of blood, inheritance, and hidden hatchets. And the house on 2nd Street, once just another clapboard dwelling, became infamous, its windows seeming to glare at passers-by with mute accusation. What truly shocked the town was not only the crime, but its intimacy. The murders had happened within the sanctity of a family home. The killer had struck in familiar rooms with familiar tools against familiar faces, and the prime suspect was not a stranger or an outsider, but a daughter, a sister, a woman who had lived beneath that roof all her life. As the sun set on Fall River, in the days after the murders, crowds still lingered outside the Borden house. Some came to gawk at the scene of horror, others to whisper prayers, and still others to speculate about the trial to come. The town was gripped by a kind of fever, not of witchcraft as Salem had once endured, but of curiosity, suspicion, and dread, and beneath it all, one question grew louder. Was Lizzie Borden the monster who had taken an axe to her own blood? Or was she an unfortunate woman ensnared by circumstance, condemned by rumor and rhyme? By June of 1893, nearly a year after the murders, the trial of Lizzie Borden had become a national obsession. Newspapers from Boston to New York splashed headlines daily, and reporters descended on Fall River like vultures on carrion. The courthouse was crowded with journalists, lawyers, townsfolk, and curious spectators, all eager to see whether the quiet, church-going spinster would be convicted of one of the most brutal crimes in American history. Lizzie arrived at the courthouse each morning dressed in black, her face pale and composed. She sat stiffly, her eyes forward, showing little emotion. Some saw her composure as a sign of cold-blooded guilt. Others interpreted it as dignity in the face of relentless scrutiny. Either way, Lizzie became a spectacle. The newspapers referred to her as the woman on trial for her life, painting her both as a monster and as a tragic figure. The prosecution built its case on motive, opportunity, and suspicion. They argued that Lizzie resented her stepmother, detested her father's stinginess, and feared her inheritance would be swallowed by Abby's family. They pointed to her inconsistent statements on the day of the murders, her claim of being in the barn with no footprints to prove it, and the suspicious burning of a dress shortly afterward. They painted a picture of a woman cornered by resentment and greed, who had finally lashed out with an axe. But the case was far from ironclad. No one had witnessed the murders. No blood-stained clothing was ever produced. The supposed murder weapon, a hatchet head found in the Borden basement, could not be definitively linked to the killings. Even the grisly photographs of the crime scenes, shocking as they were, could not place the hatchet in Lizzie's hand. The evidence was circumstantial, a puzzle of insinuations rather than proof. The most damning moment came from testimony about Lizzie's attempt to buy prussic acid, a deadly poison, in the days before the murders. A pharmacist claimed she had asked for it, but the judge ruled the testimony inadmissible, depriving the prosecution of a potential smoking gun. Without it, the case lost much of its bite. Meanwhile, Lizzie's defense team, led by former Massachusetts Governor George D. Robinson, proved formidable. They highlighted the lack of direct evidence and questioned the reliability of the police investigation. The officers, they reminded the jury, had allowed neighbors to trample the crime scene, had mishandled evidence, and had failed to secure the house properly. They argued that the case against Lizzie was built on prejudice against her composure, against her independence, and against the idea that a woman could wield such violence. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Each time a witness was called, the crowd leaned forward, waiting for revelations. Reporters scribbled furiously, their descriptions painting Lizzie as everything from a stoic martyr to a cunning murderess. The testimony of Bridget Sullivan drew particular attention. She described the events of that morning, her tasks in the heat, her discovery of Andrew's body. But when asked directly if she believed Lizzie capable of the crime, she faltered, admitting she could not say for certain. The trial was not just a legal battle. It was a cultural drama. Gender played a central role. In 1893, women were still viewed through the lens of delicacy and morality. Many Americans could not reconcile the idea of a woman, particularly a refined church-going one, committing such a gruesome act. Defense attorneys leaned into this perception, portraying Lizzie as a victim of cruel suspicion, an unmarried woman persecuted simply for not fitting neatly into society's expectations. When the time came for closing arguments, The prosecution urged the jury to look at the pattern of resentment, the suspicious dress burning, the inconsistent alibis. The defense countered with a reminder: suspicion is not proof, and to convict without proof would be a miscarriage of justice. They argued that Lizzie's gender made her an easy target, her independence a mark against her in a patriarchal society. On June 20th, 1893, after just 90 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned with its verdict: not guilty. The courtroom erupted, some in relief, others in outrage. Lizzie Borden, the woman who had stood accused of hacking her father and stepmother to death, walked free. Yet acquittal did not bring freedom in the truest sense. Outside the courthouse, the public remained divided. Some believed justice had prevailed. Others whispered that money, influence, and gender had saved Lizzie from the gallows. The rhyme, "Lizzie Borden took an axe," continued to spread, ensuring her name would forever be tied to the murders, guilty or not. For Lizzie, the trial's end marked the beginning of a new life, but not a free one. Though legally exonerated, she was socially condemned. Neighbors shunned her, friends kept their distance, and Fall River itself turned cold. The house on 2nd Street remained a monument to horror, its reputation blackened beyond repair. And Lizzie, forever haunted by suspicion, would live the rest of her days under the shadow of the axe. The trial may have ended in acquittal, but the mystery was only deepening. If Lizzie was not the killer, then who had wielded the hatchet? How had they slipped in and out unnoticed? And why had the murders happened at all? These unanswered questions festered like open wounds, ensuring the Borden story would never truly fade. When the words "not guilty" rang through the courtroom on June 20th, 1893, Lizzie Borden was legally free. But in many ways, her sentence had only just begun. She left the courthouse a woman divided, acquitted in the eyes of the law, but forever condemned in the eyes of society. Though she had escaped the gallows, she could not escape the shadow of suspicion. The axe followed her everywhere, not as a weapon in her hand, but as a symbol stamped onto her name. Lizzie returned to Fall River, but the city that had once known her as a church-going spinster now regarded her with coldness and curiosity. Neighbors turned their faces when she passed. Children taunted her in the streets, chanting the rhyme that had already cemented itself in American folklore. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. The rhyme was cruel in its exaggeration, but it was unforgettable. It spread across the country, becoming a nursery chant, a piece of morbid playground lore that ensured Lizzie's story would never die. Every repetition of those words was another reminder that though she had been acquitted, she would never be innocent in the eyes of the world. Yet Lizzie did not retreat into obscurity. Instead, she and her sister Emma used their inheritance to move out of the house on 2nd Street and into a more fashionable neighborhood. On Fall River's hill, they purchased a large home they called Maplecroft, a far cry from the modest dwelling where their father had insisted on frugality. Here, Lizzie sought the life of refinement she had long desired. Elegant furnishings, social gatherings, and the company of friends. But Fall River society was unforgiving. Invitations never arrived. Neighbors avoided the house. The sisters were ostracized, treated as pariahs despite their wealth. The strain eventually fractured the bond between Lizzie and Emma. In 1905, Emma abruptly moved out of Maplecroft after a bitter quarrel, the details of which were never fully revealed. Some whispered that Lizzie's growing friendship with a younger actress scandalized her conservative sister. Others suggested the weight of suspicion, gossip, and isolation had simply grown too heavy for Emma to bear. Whatever the cause, the two sisters who had endured a trial for their lives together would never reconcile. Lizzie remained at Maplecroft, living in relative comfort, but in near total social isolation. She traveled occasionally, even visiting Boston and New York, but wherever she went, whispers followed. In Fall River, she was referred to not by her name, but simply as Miss Borden, said with a tone that carried equal parts fear, curiosity, and disdain. The house on 2nd Street, meanwhile, became a site of morbid fascination. Though unoccupied for stretches of time, it drew the curious and the brave, eager to glimpse the place where the axe had fallen. Despite her infamy, Lizzie did find companionship in her later years. She formed close friendships, particularly with women, though many were cautious about associating too publicly with her. She poured her energy into her home and her pets, surrounding herself with animals she adored, as if their loyalty could replace the trust she had lost from people. But the weight of suspicion never lifted. Every newspaper anniversary of the murders brought her name back into print. Every retelling of the rhyme renewed the public's fascination. As the decades passed, the murders became less a crime and more a legend, a macabre story woven into the fabric of American folklore. Lizzie became less a woman and more a character, the accused murderess who haunted her own city. She lived out her days quietly at Maplecroft until June 1st, 1927, when she died at the age of 66 after a long illness. Emma died just days later. As if even in estrangement, the sisters remained bound by fate. Neither married, neither bore children, and both carried the legacy of the axe to their graves. They were buried in Oak Grove Cemetery not far from their parents, their stones plain and somber. Visitors still leave pennies, flowers, and even small hatchets at Lizzie's grave, a testament to the enduring fascination with her life and the unanswered questions that surround it. Yet death did not silence the whispers. If anything, it amplified them. The house on 2nd Street, where Andrew and Abby had met their grisly ends, grew into one of America's most infamous haunted locations. Visitors spoke of cold spots, shadowy figures, and the sound of footsteps pacing upstairs. Some claimed to hear the thud of an axe, others the muffled sobs of a woman. The murders had stained the walls not only with blood, but with memory, embedding themselves into the very structure of the house. Lizzie's acquittal left the case unresolved, and it is that unresolved nature that keeps the story alive. Was she guilty, wielding the hatchet in a storm of resentment, or was she a victim of circumstance trapped in a swirl of suspicion and gossip? With every passing year, the answer grows less certain, and the legend grows stronger. What cannot be denied is that Lizzie Borden achieved a kind of immortality. Though she may have lived her final years in isolation, her name never faded. It was spoken in whispers in Fall River, sung in rhymes on playgrounds, printed in bold type in newspapers, and repeated in countless retellings. She became a symbol, not just of crime, but of the ways society judges, condemns, and remembers. In life, she was ostracized. In death, she became eternal. The woman acquitted of murder, but forever tied to the axe lives on. Her story bound inseparably to the house on 2nd Street, to the rhyme, and to the restless fascination of a public that has never stopped asking. Did she do it? Long after the trial ended, long after Lizzie and Emma were buried in the cold soil of Oak Grove Cemetery, the house on 2nd Street remained. Weathered and ordinary in appearance, it stood as a silent witness to the blood spilled within its walls. Yet for many, the Borden house was more than a crime scene preserved in history. It was a place alive with echoes, haunted not only by memory, but by something darker that refused to leave. Almost immediately after the murders, whispers began. Neighbors claimed they heard strange sounds at night drifting from the house, footsteps when no one was inside, the creak of floorboards, and the faint echo of muffled cries. For decades, the house passed through various owners, some living there, quietly, others departing quickly after reporting unexplained disturbances. The legend of the Borden murders grew, and with it, the belief that the spirits of Andrew and Abby, or perhaps Lizzie herself, remained tethered to the site. Visitors told stories of cold drafts that seemed to move with intent, icy fingers brushing across their skin, and the sensation of being watched from darkened corners. Some claimed to see shadowy figures pacing the upstairs hallway, while others swore they heard the dull thud of an axe, followed by silence so heavy it pressed against the chest. One particularly chilling report described the faint sound of a woman weeping in the guest bedroom, the very room where Abby Borden met her violent end. In time, the house became more than just a residence. It became a destination. Paranormal investigators, drawn by its grim reputation, flocked to Fall River with cameras, recorders, and open ears. Television crews captured eerie footage, objects moving on their own, disembodied voices caught on tape, temperature drops that defied explanation. Skeptics dismiss these claims as tricks of the imagination, the natural product of suggestion in a place steeped in horror. Yet for those who experienced it firsthand, the encounters felt undeniably real. The house was eventually restored to resemble its 1892 appearance, complete with period furnishings, giving visitors the unsettling impression of stepping back in time to the day of the murders. Tourists walked through the narrow hallways where Lizzie once moved, stood in the parlor where Andrew's body was found, and lingered in the guest bedroom where Abby fell. Many reported feeling lightheaded, overcome with dread, or suddenly cold, as though invisible presences pressed against them. Some of the most persistent stories centered on the basement, where investigators had once found the hatchets during the initial police search. Guests described an oppressive atmosphere, heavy and suffocating, as though the air itself bore the weight of accusation. A few claimed to see glowing eyes in the shadows, vanishing when approached. Even seasoned paranormal researchers admitted the basement carried a unique energy, unlike any other room in the house. Yet perhaps the most unnerving tales come from the bedrooms. Overnight visitors, for the house now operates as both a museum and bed and breakfast, often report being awakened by footsteps pacing outside their doors. Others claim their blankets were tugged, or that they felt someone sit on the edge of their bed, though no one was there. In the room where Bridget Sullivan once slept, guests have reported hearing a woman's voice with an Irish lilt, whispering or sighing in the dark. The most infamous space remains the guest bedroom, where Abby's body was discovered. Guests describe lying awake only to hear the faint creak of footsteps and the sickening sound of a body falling to the floor. Some say they see fleeting glimpses of a woman's shadow near the bed, her form twisted and broken. Paranormal investigators using spirit boxes have reported chilling responses. Voices claiming, "I'm here," or simply repeating the name Abby. The sitting room, where Andrew's body was found, has its own share of phenomena. Some visitors swear they feel sudden nausea or a stabbing pain in their head as they approach the sofa. Others insist they see Andrew's figure briefly reflected in mirrors, only to vanish when they turn. Tour guides tell of guests bolting from the room, unable to shake the sense that someone or something lingers in the corner, silently watching. Whether these experiences are true hauntings or the product of imagination, the result is the same. The Lizzie Borden house has become a legend in its own right, one of the most infamous haunted locations in America. Its grim reputation draws thousands each year, from curious tourists to hardened ghost hunters. For some, it is history. For others, it is proof that the dead do not rest easily where injustice reigns. The murders of Andrew and Abby Borden stained the house not only with blood but with memory. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the shutters, carries with it the weight of suspicion, guilt, and unanswered questions. Did Lizzie strike the blows? And if so, does her spirit linger still, unrepentant, restless, chained to the house by the act itself? Or are the hauntings echoes of Andrew and Abby, trapped in a cycle of fear and pain, reliving their last moments in endless repetition? To step inside the Borden house today is to step into a story that is still unfolding. It is to walk through rooms where time has frozen, where the line between past and present blurs. It is to confront the possibility that history does not stay buried, but instead breathes in the spaces it once consumed. And for HauntQuestTV, it is to uncover not just a crime, but a haunting. One that bridges the gap between history and legend, between fact and fear. More than a century has passed since the murders at 92 2nd Street, yet the name Lizzie Borden still stirs unease, curiosity, and fascination. Her story has seeped into American folklore, surviving not merely as history, but as myth. A legend whispered in classrooms, repeated in playground rhymes, and immortalized in countless books, films, and television programs. Few crimes endure in the public imagination as Lizzie's has, and fewer still leave behind a house that breathes with the weight of both tragedy and haunting. Part of the legend lies in the unanswered questions. Lizzie was acquitted, but suspicion never lifted. No one else was ever charged. No alternate suspect convincingly identified. Theories abound that Bridget Sullivan, the maid, snapped after years of mistreatment. that an unknown intruder somehow slipped in and out unnoticed, that Emma, the elder sister, may have played some role. But none of these theories have ever taken root as firmly as the suspicion that Lizzie herself wielded the hatchet. The ambiguity is what keeps the tale alive. The Borden murders are not merely about guilt or innocence, but about uncertainty, the unanswered puzzle that invites endless retelling. Equally enduring is the rhyme. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. This verse, catchy and brutal, ensured Lizzie's immortality. It matters little that the numbers are wrong, or that Lizzie was legally found not guilty. In the public's imagination, rhyme became truth, and truth became irrelevant. The power of folklore overtook the power of fact, turning Lizzie into something more than a suspect. She became a symbol, a character, an archetype of female violence and mystery. The house itself fuels the legend. Today, the Lizzie Borden house operates as both a museum and a bed and breakfast, drawing visitors from around the world. Guests can sleep in the very rooms where Andrew and Abby were slain, walk the narrow hallways where suspicion brewed, and sit in the parlor where Andrew drew his final breath. For some, it is a macabre thrill. For others, it is a brush with the supernatural. The stories of hauntings, footsteps, whispers, shadowy figures, only deepen the house's pull. To sleep there is to place oneself in the middle of history and legend, hoping to feel the echo of one of America's most infamous crimes. Culturally, Lizzie's story continues to inspire art and interpretation. Plays and operas have been written about her. Films and documentaries retell her story with fresh spins, and her image appears in everything from horror anthologies to pop culture references. She is portrayed alternately as a cold-blooded murderess, a victim of patriarchal oppression, or a misunderstood woman caught in a web of circumstance. Each retelling reshapes her legacy, but none erase it. Yet beneath the folklore and fascination lies something darker, the reminder of how violence shatters lives, and how quickly society can brand someone guilty without proof. Lizzie's acquittal may have spared her from the noose, but it condemned her to a lifetime of isolation. The murders, whether committed by her hand or not, destroyed not only her family but her reputation, her social standing, and her chance at an ordinary life. She lived and died in the shadow of the axe, her existence a haunting of its own. For Fall River, the legacy is complicated. The town once recoiled from the notoriety, ashamed to be known for blood and scandal. Yet over time it embraced the story, transforming it into history and tourism. Today, the Lizzie Borden house is one of Fall River's most famous landmarks, drawing thousands each year. The city's name is forever tied to hers, its reputation inseparable from the crime that took place more than a century ago. But the deepest legacy of Lizzie Borden may be the way her story blurs the line between history and haunting, between fact and folklore. She has become both a historical figure and a ghost story, her presence lingering not only in the rooms of the Second Street house but in the collective imagination. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the rhyme, every shadow in the corner becomes part of the legend. A reminder that some stories never die, they simply change form. Even now, those who spend the night in the Borden house speak of waking in the dark, their hearts pounding, convinced that someone stands at the foot of the bed. They whisper of hearing the faint thud of an axe, of seeing a pale figure vanish through the doorway, of voices calling softly in the night. Whether real or imagined, these experiences tether the living to the past, making the line between history and haunting vanish. Lizzie Borden remains a riddle without an answer, a name without resolution. Did she do it? Was she wrongly accused? Or was the truth buried with her, leaving only shadows to speak for her now? The legend endures because the answer is unknowable, and in that uncertainty lies power. The power to haunt, to fascinate, to endure. For HauntQuestTV, the story of Lizzie Borden is more than just a retelling of murder. It is a journey into the blurred space where crime becomes folklore, where houses become haunted, and where names live on long after the body is gone. The Borden house is not simply a relic of the past. It is a mirror, reflecting our fascination with mystery, violence, and the ghosts we create when truth slips through our fingers. In the end, Lizzie Borden's story is not about whether she lifted the axe, It is about how we remember, how we judge, and how legends grow from blood and silence. The rhyme may never die, the house may never rest, and the name Lizzie Borden will forever echo, as both history and haunting, a shadow that will never fade,